Hi there! Come join us over on The Deprogram, a podcast I run with Second Thought and Yugopnik.
To quote our favorite authoritarian GT, have these gentlemen ever seen these nuts?
Intro topics, history, memes, and me being perpetually tired, all of it is at your disposal over on the links in the description and pinned comment. This video is a companion to our recent episode titled Tanky Discourse. Go check it out! Alright, let's get into it. Tanky is a term you hear thrown around a lot, but it seemingly doesn't have any meaning. The quick summary is, it doesn't really. Well, it kinda does, but the intention behind its use is generally nebulous, and the term is expanded so much as to be meaningless. The origins of the term. Originally, tanky was a term that originated in the British left wing for those that supported the Soviet intervention in Hungary. The intervention is a huge topic in and of itself, so take a look at the history of the working class movement in Hungary for a deeper dive. TLDR, it's far more complicated than libertarian socialist uprising or complete fascist takeover. Regardless, neither that Hungarian Republic nor the USSR are with us today, so why is the term still used? What people mean. Nowadays, the term tanky is mostly used by people, some of which claiming to be leftist while others clearly not, to refer derogatorily to... Well, here's where it gets a little more complicated. There are a few targets. Number 1, in the narrowest possible definition, tankies are those that are more or less partial to the experiences and lessons of former socialist as well as current socialist examples, as well as their leaders, for example the USSR, Cuba, Vietnam, etc. Number 2, slightly broader, a tanky is anyone who defends or more commonly simply clarifies misconceptions around former socialisms. A tanky also usually presents a nuanced understanding of why certain actions were taken, which some interpret as running defense for something supposedly inexcusable. Number 3, broader still, as a catch-all term for Marxist-Leninists and adjacent ideologies, which usually encapsulate support for the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, democratic centralism, the active suppression of the bourgeoisie, a more involved approach towards internal security, economic planning, etc. This also usually follows the condemnation of the use of force in times when it was possible that it was warranted. This links well with the general link with authoritarianism, which we'll touch on soon. Anti-Imperialism, and by extension Anti-Americanism too, fits here, so I'll mention it. Number 4, much more commonly, tanky is a lazy term used to demonize people to the left of the one using the term, generally intended to dismiss and ostracize said people without engaging or offering a counter-argument. This particular usage case is most common with liberals who adopt a radical lib approach without any theoretically derived radical content besides engagement in electoral politics and an allegiance to American exceptionalism. A derived term, although even more nebulous, is red fascist, usually just shortened to red fash, but we're not going to touch on that today. And number 5, finally, the caricature. A person that doesn't exist with opinions that no one really holds, but it's used for soy Wojak memes, as the internet usually does. It's supposed to mean someone who uncritically supports everything a socialist nation does. These people don't exist. The USSR or China or Stalin did nothing wrong is a meme set online as a joke, no one actually believes it. Likewise, seeing someone saying something on Twitter and interpreting that opinion as representative of the entire movement is silly. In my personal experience, you won't ever see a more critical and nuanced view of, for example, the USSR than from someone who has actually taken the effort to properly study that system, usually a well-read Marxist-Leninist. We have a dedicated episode on that topic here. What's the point? More or less, it's a commonality of politics to invent derogatory terms for those that you disagree with. This example is no different. In almost all use cases I've seen, it's used exclusively online by mostly radlibs and other quasi-liberal types to dismiss an argument or person without engaging with the content itself. I remember anarchists, ancoms, and the like using it plenty before, but that usage has died down over the past several years, from what I've seen. Regardless, a good point to note is that if we're using the term against people who recognize the achievements of former socialisms and adhere to more or less orthodox theoretical approaches to socialism, meaning Marxist-Leninist ones, then this term is a little more than, hopefully, an unintentional condemnation of third world or imperial periphery leftists. The vast majority, dare I say all actually influential Marxist thinkers of the 20th century, fit the tanky label if applied uniformly. Even more so when looking at post-independence, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist, read Black and Brown, figures. The vast majority of active leftists globally, the ones agitating for socialism, are people who identify with Marxism-Leninism or an adjacent offshoot, who recognize and respect the lessons of former socialist experiments, are usually part of Marxist-Leninist parties, and uphold figures that symbolize the revolutionary socialist movement. In essence, the vast majority of the global left would be tanky in that case. What does that say about the so-called non-tanky Western left, though? Isn't it at least a little infantilizing and Eurocentric to consider that only the West has it right, meanwhile the vast majority of historic as well as modern revolutionary leftists had it entirely wrong? Likewise, the term seems to apply selectively. Those with incredibly similar beliefs and approaches may get the label on them, or not usually based on the level of demonization in common anti-communist American media, or based on how much that particular individual likes said figure. Concretely, Sankara and Castro aren't too different from Kim Il-sung or Honecker. On authority. Another point usually tied into tanky discourse is the idea of authority or authoritarianism. Before getting into it, the term is also incredibly nebulous. Between dictionaries and various quote-unquote respectable encyclopedias, you get several incredibly broad or contradictory definitions. As with totalitarianism, it's more of an invented political term, used in attempts by particularly American academia to lump fascism with socialism. This is further strengthened by the fact that the same yardstick can parallel, for example, the US very well, or even better than the intended nation that label is being placed upon, yet it's rarely done. Typical government versus regime language in an attempt to more subtly shape what you think. For the liberals in the crowd, name something you dislike about authoritarian socialist governments, and a government model you look up to or believe is viable to reform has most likely done the same at some point to differing extents. I would actually say the prime liberal democratic example, the United States, has done far worse on almost every account, but they're always spared the term or the criticism. A fairly decent read I'd recommend on this topic is Human Rights in the Soviet Union by Albert Szymanski. Likewise, to anarchist listeners, every prior example anarchists uphold had exclusive access to and use of arms, had labor discipline, an internal security apparatus, a system of prisons which included political prisoners, a hierarchical bureaucracy, exclusive control of sources of media, conscription, I could go on. It seems the only successful socialist attempts at building something tangible gets this authoritarian label thrown on it, likewise with this tanky business. The anarchist examples were commendable, but in the end failed fairly early on and in a way that spares them that criticism. My point is, the methods before, during, and after a revolution will always be categorized according to authoritarian means, and hence pretending that revolution, the violent overthrow of one class by another, and the forceful establishment of some form of proletarian rule, be it a state or democratic federated workers' councils, as not authoritarian is just silly. If your issue is less the means and more with the degree of community control, well, this is a question of theory and pragmatism. Any genuine leftist would like nothing more than community control. The thing is, after a revolution, and a civil war, and a reactionary former landlord to fascist movement, foreign sabotage, internal spying, fifth columns, and you end up with a strong centralized state, with a highly developed internal security apparatus, and more restrictive ideas on certain forms of expression. You can disagree with it, sure, but to claim you don't understand why it happened, or to refuse to recognize why is just silly. We discussed this point to far deeper levels on the podcast episode, so do check it out. The history of the 20th century paints a very clear picture. Socialism is the way forward for the actual majority of humanity, and reform has been proven a failure time and time again. See our episode on that here. This leaves us with revolution as the only viable option, which likewise mostly occurred as a result of a party constituted from the working class with sufficient political will and the support of the people. The work of said party and the mass of the population may, we hope, culminate in revolution and the seizure of state power. This will naturally involve some level of violence, as no ruling class in history has ever peacefully given up their own power. Not only this, but it's also logical to assume based on the historical image that once state power is seized, that fledgling nation will require all sorts of new organizations to protect the new gains of the working class, an internal security apparatus, a military of some size, or nuclear weapons, or something similar. Certain levels of oppression against reactionary sections of the population, landlords, former capitalists, fascists, etc. This will take the form of prison or re-education or possibly even more severe measures if necessary, for example in the case of counter-revolutionary terrorism, as occurred to various extents throughout socialist history. In the messy post-revolutionary period, it's also logical to expect excesses, although they are undesirable and should be limited to the maximum extent. Does that make all of this right? Maybe not, but you can see why it would be necessary. Give Frederick Engels on authority a read. Anti-Americanism. This is an interesting point, the one of anti-Americanism. More recently, I've seen the label tanky thrown around, especially concerning one's perspective on the US and its place in the world. There are some that claim tankies uncritically dislike the US to such a point that they'll end up strange bedfellows to groups or nations that they otherwise wouldn't or shouldn't ideologically support. Putting aside the meaningless content of that support, meaning if you're not sending money or guns or specialists or information, what material reality is there to your so-called support? Let's take a deeper look. First and foremost, again, this is an incredibly online phenomenon. Just because some guy on Twitter said something doesn't make it representative of the actual real-life movement. Likewise, just because your local 32-member Communist Party in the Imperial Core has some out-there beliefs doesn't make it representative of a movement that spans millions and the entire globe. This in and of itself should be enough to discount this anti-American tanky connection. However, for those that believe in this connection, there is a strange dismissal of certain geopolitical realities and likewise actual anti-imperialist approaches. There are such things as primary and secondary contradictions. Likewise, class struggle above all is cute but falls apart in the complexities of reality, with the perfect example being the existence of the illegal settler colonial military occupation of Palestine. We need to be materialists about this. Having a critically supportive overview of, for example, Gaddafi isn't based in anti-Americanism, but is based in tangible benefits that administration brought to Libya. Being critically supportive of the Syrian government's attempts at piecing the nation back together after being ravaged by US-backed militias of all ideological stripes doesn't emanate from an anti-Americanism, but from a sober understanding that stability under that government is far more likely, especially when the reason for the massive geopolitical disruption in the region wasn't an organic leftist movement to begin with. You can disagree with the reasoning, sure, but to claim that this number one makes you a tanky and number two is mostly based in anti-Americanism is incredibly myopic and shows just how little this term means. Secondly, calling whataboutism when someone replies the US is currently doing worse things as we speak is less about ignoring non-American examples of things worthy of condemnation and more a highlighting of the supreme hypocrisy of liberals that have endless criticisms for everything non-American but never even so much as graze genuine and principled analysis of the US, NATO, or other related entities. That doesn't mean you should go, what about blank, each time something is brought up. Actually the inverse, you should be well read enough to be able to rightfully criticize the things worthy of criticism while being able to provide nuance to the rest which requires nuance. It's a delicate process. That's why whataboutism doesn't happen between principled and educated Marxists, even on contentious issues within the left. The importance of our past in light of our future. An important side note is to always study our history and learn from it. Dismissing it is either lazy or ignorant, and likewise arguing from oh, that wasn't real socialism, that was just tankies, makes you look ridiculous as you give the enemies of socialism ammunition against the whole movement in the propaganda war, which the left has far less resource-wise in fighting. You can disagree with the collectivization of agriculture in the USSR, for example, but that disagreement only means something when you understand the material conditions that gave rise to the necessity of that change in the first place. Likewise with how it was carried out, how it progressed, what went wrong, and what could be changed in the future. You should be able to put forth alternatives. Same thing with the Great Leap Forward, or the failures of the many dozens of movements globally before even capturing power. Stalin and his consequences are important whether you like it or not, and without understanding what came before, we can't hope to be successful in future attempts. In essence, this is yet another attempt by me to encourage people to actually read boring, long, and intricate theoretical and scientific work so that we can actually have something novel to contribute in building a movement. Conclusion. If you don't understand a particular perspective, ask why, dig into things. Simplistic answers are no answers at all, and there's always more nuance to be had. You're always free to disagree, and as Marxists we encourage that. But the truth of one particular tendency does seem to annoyingly always present itself, at least in my experience. At this point, tanky is overused to the point that it becomes absolutely meaningless. Kinda like woke for conservatives, it's a catch-all term for things I don't like. For liberals, it's a lazy approach to political engagement. For those that consider themselves socialist, it's evidence of the ossification, lack of creativity, and lack of actually doing the fucking reading among the Western left, from which these ideas almost exclusively emanate from what I've seen. Much more important is the value of learning from former socialist experiments rather than simply dismissing them, as well as understanding the nuances which lead to the decisions they took. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be condemned when it's correct to do so, but likewise this condemnation needs an appropriate time, place, audience, and format for it to be meaningful if the person is acting in good faith. Otherwise it's vitriol, an attempt to shut down conversation which doesn't help the movement, which interestingly enough is the motive of some that use this term. This really is the issue. Go outside and actually contribute. If you see weirdos, avoid them. The internet isn't real life, and that's where most of this brain-dead discourse on both sides solely resides. Check out the podcast while you're at it. It's a fun ride, I promise. That's it for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Viton, Kelsil, Furry Beaver, Dick Wolf, okay come on, The Sebester, The Sepster, Gus Carlisle, Wyatt, Jasonian Ringu, Jack Leary, Erlen Borda, Anatole Arison, Nanya Biss, Sleuthmakers, Gary the Gary, Torin Rettig, Misling, Ray Blue, Daniel, Lena Yumin, Aprol, Neox, Saraktonos,
Jacob Corvinus, Cayenne Berberi, Exploding Turtle, Vanish, Gold, Blimbo, Augustus Limond, and Professional Strawberry. Thanks for watching.